Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is going to be our third lecture in our Intro to Critical Theory series that we're offering through the spring semester of 2024. And we're going to be dealing with the Communist Manifesto or the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The edition I'm using is just from the classic Marx and Engels reader, so my page numbers come from that. Most of what I'm going to do here is just cover the manifesto from where it is, so walking through it. I will occasionally break out of my script in my video lecture here. At one point towards the end, I will bring things into a current US context a little bit for some of the examples that I use in the later sections. And that's in part to be intentionally provocative. There is a kind of freshness, I think, that we have whenever I reread this piece of literature, this piece of this statement. It's very well written. There's quite a bit of elegance that Marx has. We definitely see his training and his interest in literature and journalism in the composing of this piece. And again, if you've been watching my earlier lectures, I've been trying to push back a little bit against this idea that just if you are even interested in critical theory, that automatically makes you a Marxist or a leftist. And the reason why I've been pushing back against that is because I don't think that the critical theorists are necessarily dogmatic Marxists to begin with. And so that's kind of a misconception. And also because in current discourse on critical theory, as I've mentioned, there's been critique of particularly the Frankfurt School and their allegiances to liberalism rather than any kind of an allegiance to socialism or to communism. And so it's just not true within the field, that all of the to be doing critical theory or that the critical theorists of the 20th century were in any way aligned with a strictly Marxian perspective. That is not to say that Marx is not super important to them and important as a thinker, but if anything, early critical theorists were trying to analyze something that was missing in Marx, just as the young Hegelians from my last lecture were trying to do an analysis of Hegel, definitely influenced by Hegel, but they were trying to find something that was missing in Hegel's thinking as well. So this is just part of how the dialectical or process of things go when people are working with writing and philosophers from an earlier time period. And just because of where I work and teach from, there's the general hostility in the United States from McCarthyism on, if not before, just towards anything Marx related or communism or any of that sort of stuff. And my main interest in this course as an intro to critical theory is covering the historical grounds and just thinking about like what do these documents mostly say. Although, again, I get it that people get passionate about this kind of stuff. And so I will bring some of the end of the manifesto into current conditions and cultural conditions in the United States to be provocative and maybe fun or maybe annoying. I don't know. So I'm going to uh, share my screen here, pull up my notes. As always, I read from my notes to keep myself on track. And I will occasionally, go off script to clarify things. Let's jump in here for notes on the Communist Manifesto. The first thing that we need to note with the Manifesto of the Communist Party is its clear indebtedness to Hegel's concept of history as proceeding through a dialectical process. I covered that in my previous lecture. Marx and Engels, who were by then in Paris, were commissioned by activists to produce the text during a period of working class revolt on the European continent. There are revolts all over the place in Germany in 1848 for sure, in France of 1848. Eventually, Marx and Engels get pushed out of Paris. They have to go to England. They go to London after that. And not all of the revolts, it's important to note from the beginning, not all of the revolts are using the term communist or communism for working class revolts. That's just the word that Marx gives to this. So both of Marx's grandfathers, a little bit of biographical background here, both of Marx's grandfathers were Jewish rabbis, but his father was a lawyer during a brief period of tolerance for Jews as citizens following the French Revolution. After Napoleon, anti-Semitic laws barring Jews from civic offices were reintroduced, and Marx's father was forced to convert to Protestantism to maintain his practice as a lawyer. So this goes back to my earlier lecture, right? That after, even in Germany, like initially the French Revolution seems like a positive thing for lots and lots of folks, like that there's going to be some liberation with the shift towards the nation state. There had to be a shift in thinking about who are the communities of people that make up the citizenry of the nation state. And if there's going to be a push towards Enlightenment notions of secularization, then Jews cannot be discriminated against anymore. This is something that Hannah Arendt, great critical theorist, covers in much, much more detail in her Origins of Totalitarianism, that we get this kind of in Europe, this shift towards some kind of nation state. Now, remember that for Hegel, the state is a Christian entity, but maybe not in France, for example. So we get this period where Jews are going to be potentially less discriminated against. And then we get the reintroduction of laws that bar them from certain offices. So the anti-Semitism comes back, and the kind of push-pull of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness, since that term anti-Semite was coined later on in the 19th century. We see that there are gains, and then there's retrogression for the acceptance of Jews in the dominant Euro-Christian society of the time period. So Marx, after Napoleon, anti-Semitic laws barring Jews from civic offices are reintroduced, and Marx's father was forced to convert to Protestantism to maintain his practice as a lawyer. He initially pushed Marx to study law, but Marx was interested in philosophy and literature, which caused a rift between him and his father. Also, Marx appears to have been kind of a partier in his college years, not necessarily living really cleanly. Marx's doctoral thesis comparing Democritean and Epicurean accounts of nature sought to prove that religion must be subordinate to philosophy. He was an avowed atheist in terms of faith, but of course, Jewishness is not necessarily defined in terms of faith. And his account of religion is in line with the young Hegelian circle in which he developed early on. Now, remember from my earlier lecture, it was not necessarily that the young Hegelians point that religion is just all bad or something like that. It's that religion must be realized as its historical process in the development of human history, and that's coming out of Hegel. Now, there were kind of illiberal moves that were made within the governments that are in power at the time that young Hegelians are writing, and so they see the state as being an apparatus for bourgeois control, rather than a liberating apparatus, as someone like Hegel might have seen it. So you have the kind of conservative Hegelians who want to see a potential for the state to um, allow for like the Christian flourishing of citizens. And the young Hegelians on the left are saying, no, it's not just the state and its religiosity itself that has been part of a bourgeois ideology with the state. That's why it's backwards, and we need to push away from that. So the allergy towards religion that we see in the young Hegelians and then with Marx comes from that position as well. Although one could think that as an individual um, who has a Jewish background who's been discriminated against in that particular sense as well might lead someone like Marx to have a negative view of religiosity because of the ways that it allows people to discriminate against people with his own background. Of course, he writes on the Jewish question and stuff. We're just not covering that in this class, but you can definitely read on that. And he definitely gets discriminated against by many, many people who are anti-Jewish themselves. So part of anti-communism and anti-Marxism, oftentimes when people are making those blanket charges, you need to sort of be careful about the ways that people level their charges to see whether or not it's aligned with a kind of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness as well. Of course, that's what's going on by the time we get to the Nazis, but that's well after Marx is dead. So, he's an avowed atheist. His account of religion is in line with the young Hegelians. The manifesto gives the name communism to what would have been various uprisings by the working classes throughout Europe. Quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle, famous line from the beginning of the manifesto. Here we see that there's a materialist critique, which is present also in the theses on Feuerbach, which we talked about in the last lecture. It's realized through an emphasis on human social relationships, which for Marx is going to be class struggle. So the shift towards material history away from Hegelian idealism is going to focus on human social relationships, which he frames in terms of the class struggle. The mark of the current age, again, the current age of the 1840s, right? In the manifesto is increasing separation between two realized social classes, proletarian and bourgeoisie. Their relationship is characterized as a conflict and oppression of the proletarians by the bourgeoisie. Marx characterizes this as a development from feudal times. He characterizes the bourgeois rise to power with the expansion of world trade, the discovery of the Americas, so-called discovery of the Americas, right? World trade with India, figuring out how to navigate around the Cape as a southern point of Africa, all sorts of that increases world trade. With that, there's the shift from feudal culture to bourgeois power. Against both Christianity and Hegel, who conceived of the state as an apparatus for Christian habitude, Marx claims, quote, the executive of the state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was initially revolutionary, according to Marx's reading, by putting an end to feudalism. It replaced religion with an egotistical calculation. Cash payments replace the idea of social superiors. Personal worth becomes seen in terms of exchange value and free trade. It replaces religious oppression with brutal exploitation of the lower classes. Now, remember back to Feuerbach's essence of Christianity. Some of this stuff is showing up where Feuerbach is saying that Christianity has become the appearance of Christianity during his period. The bourgeoisie then constantly reinvents instruments of production, which translates into a shift in social relations. This creates the need for an ever-expanding market, quote, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises world literature. It draws all barbarian nations into civilization. Politics become centralized. Towns control the country. Um, and nature is subjugated by machinery. All of these things come with the ever expanding market. The market controls things. The market is the people who have a say in the market, and the investments are the capitalists who are the bourgeoisie. A state, a similar revolution to the earlier times, says the manifesto, is occurring in the 1840s. There's become with the rise of the bourgeoisie as the dominant class, there's become an overproduction that marks the period. A new laboring class, the proletariat, has emerged entirely dependent on exchanging their labor for working wages, but their ability to find work depends on the ability for their work to increase the capital of the bourgeoisie. So by becoming more specialized in their labor, they give up any kind of personal relationship to the thing that they make. If you're working on an assembly line and in a factory, you learn how to do one particular thing that you repeat over and over again, but you don't necessarily know how to make all of the final product that you are making. So in some sense, your specialization reduces your skills to understand how the makings of what you're doing that contribute to the making of the whole thing. Their labor is alienated as wages become abstractly and temporally based by the hour, for example, or by the day. Quote, the proletarian becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only in the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Labor then is reduced not to the thing that I make or my putting my own heart into something. Labor is just reduced to subsistence living in the current industrialized conditions. Overproduction results in longer working hours for less money. You have to work longer to make enough just to get by because the wages have been lowered because there's been the commodities that you're producing have been overproduced, and so their cost has come down. Money paid that you earn, if you're a proletarian, money that you're paid is immediately then taken by landowners and shopkeepers, pawnbrokers, etc. Peasants and small trade people and handicraftsmen all become part of the proletariat over time. It's a process of developing this new class. The formation of the proletariat is gradual, but it grows with the growth of industry into a distinct class. Um, yeah, there's fits and starts with the emergence of this new class. So some of them might begin to form trade unions, for example. They're occasionally even victorious. But the real formation of the class is constantly upset by competition among workers for petty gains. So eventually, there's going to be more unity. Quote, all previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities, but the proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. This begins at first as a national struggle. So we have a formation of the proletarian working classes with industrialization. It's emerged, the consciousness of the class itself emerges at first at the national struggle, where each country must settle its own situation. The bourgeoisie then becomes unfit to rule. Quote, it is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure the existence to its slave within its slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. End quote. The situation is unsustainable, according to Marx and Engels. Quote, the development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers, its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And so we get like the poetic kind of language of Marx here, right? That what it produces is its own gravediggers. Uh, I think what's important also sort of to note here is that when we see this emphasis on the slave and the master, that's clearly hearkening back to Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Now, remember, the master and the slave are not either in their current state as master and slave are not fully conscious. It's only through the emergence of consciousness of the slave who then contends with the master that we get a kind of egalitarian or an equal sort of mutual recognition of each other that then produces society. So this is this historical process is sort of being framed within the ways that that Marx and Engels are referring to the language of Hegel, of the language of master and slave here. There's a whole process being built in. And so the proletariat is not a completely defined class. It's something that has been emerging since the dominance of the bourgeoisie, since the end of feudalism. So then we get a distinction between proletarians and communists. Not everyone who's in the proletarian class maybe is going to self-identify as a communist. The role of the communists is not to oppose any class party or to invite sectarianism among the classes. The goal of the communist is, quote, to point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationality. One thing I want to say about that statement is that, you might not be a part of the proletarian class in order to be a communist then, that the implication here is not that. So there's a lot of finger pointing when people start getting into discourse about this. It's like, oh, you're too, you come from too much of a middle class family. You can never understand what it's really like. And sometimes that charge has been made against Marx too, who came from a family that had done fairly well for itself. But Engels' family had actually owned factories. And so Engels had a little bit more firsthand experience with what actually happened in factories. As opposed to Marx. But I think that what Marx is saying is that there's a distinction between that the communist has a kind of recognition of the bigger picture here. So secondly, communists differ from, what distinguishes communists from just proletarians is that in the various stages of development, which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they, the communists, always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. Now, here's where we get into some blurring with 20th century endeavors such as Bolshevism, because Marx says, quote, the communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all the others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. All the way through critical theory, which is, of course, what this lecture is ultimately guided toward, is going to be this critique of whether or not doing theory actually makes us too much academics, makes us too much elites, somehow separates us from actual working classes. And the whole discourse of theory, the whole project of doing critical theory is going to fall along that kind of tension. But that tension exists within the way that Marx and Engels have characterized the manifesto of the Communist Party itself, right? So Marx explicitly warns against communist theories that are invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. So how do we reconcile this statement with mass education programs or secret police totalitarian tendencies of figures like Stalin, or even someone with the charisma of Mao Zedong? In his autobiography, for example, the Dalai Lama mentions how Mao himself was always able to convince him of the necessity of the Cultural Revolution, yet no one after Mao could do it for the Dalai Lama. So there does seem to be this kind of charismatic quality that someone like Mao has, or that someone has like Lenin has. And that's not necessarily the thing that Marx is calling for in the Communist Manifesto, except that the communist versus the average proletarian is able to sort of see a bigger picture, right? So this is all part of that tension between who is really in the know about the ways that things need to happen, much less how to make the things happen. So such an experience seems both reminiscent, also not just of Mao Zedong and the Dalai Lama, but such an experience seems reminiscent of the Stalin-Trotsky fracture after Lenin's death, and even I say the Shia-Sunni fracture after the death of the Islamic Prophet, and new religious movements, which sometimes people have characterized Marxism as a kind of new or secular religion or something like that. It seems to be in new religious movements in general that when the initial founder dies, there tends to be a conflict that emerges among different groups for the authority of where to take the religion on. And so at least we've seen after Lenin, there's the fight between Lenin and or between Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky eventually gets assassinated by Stalin. And then after the Islamic Prophet, passes, we get the Shia Sunni fracture right away. Marx goes on to point out another important nuance. Quote, the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolishment of property generally. It's not like you don't have clothes of your own, but the abolishment of bourgeois property. But the modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms and on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. A lot of times when people have not studied Marxism or communism in general, we get this kind of abolition of private property idea, but we don't necessarily get the nuance that Marx is providing here, and the way that he says that private property develops as the particular thing that the bourgeois class has come to give to itself and to allow for itself that it disallows to everybody else. So the qualification is important here. Marx then moves on into a deeper analysis of capital here. Capital, Marx and Engels argue, is, quote, the kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. For people new to thinking about this and critiques of capitalism, or even not critiques of capitalism, capital is not just money, right? Capital is not just being able, I go to the store and I buy something, or I have enough money to buy something. Capital is the money that we are, the wealth that we are allowed to invest in the means of production that we then own. So the capitalist is the owner of the means of production, not just the person who has the money to buy the things that they want. The capitalist has a personal status in production, but capital is in actuality a collective product. Capital is therefore not a personal, it is a social power. That's the problem that Marx and Engels are pointing out, is that what happens is the bourgeois capitalism and private property fabricates an idea of individual ownership of something that's actually materially and collectively produced. Capitalists then attack communists or communism for destroying their freedom, but their freedom is only acquired through the oppression of others. True freedom would be something that lifted up all of society itself. So the contradiction present in capitalism is that it's has the ideology that it promotes individual freedom, but it really only promotes individual freedom for a certain class of people. Um, Quote, you are horrified. They're talking as if they're talking to people who are critiquing the communists. You capitalists are horrified at our doing away with private property, but in your society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. So the implication here is that the only true individuals with freedom are the bourgeoisie. They then address the charge by anti-communists that if we had a communist society, that laziness will ensue if communism comes about. But they say that the bourgeois are already the lazy ones who don't have to work. Um, they lament the potential loss of culture, but it's only the bourgeoisie who are able to participate in the finer things of society. Who like working class people don't get to go to the opera or to go to the symphony or any of that kind of thing. Um, the capitalists merely then lament the loss of their freedom to um, be oppressive and to enslave others for their benefit. The bourgeois notion of the family works the same way. Working class people are not able to spend time in family comfort. They're working all the time just to survive. Family is a bourgeois ideological construct that many working class people aspire to, but are not able to achieve. Quote, do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. So we might have family values, and this is something especially in a US culture today that like among working class people, yes, there is this kind of like high focus on family, right? But when working class people buy into that ideological construct, um, uh, they miss the people who really get to enjoy what the sort of nuclear family is, are the people who are the bourgeoisie instead. Um, so then Marx and Engels addressed the lamentation that public education will replace home education, saying that communists seek only seek to rescue education from the influence of the working class. They then address gender. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears the instruments of production are to be exploited in common and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot being of being common to all will likewise fall to women. So, in other words, because the bourgeois conditions see women as property to begin with, the abolishment of private property means that their women will no longer be forced to serve only them or have sex with only them. So sexuality, gender relations then become part of the bourgeois establishment or ideology for how things, what seem to be the conditions of a man's sort of control over his woman as property are really just manifestations of bourgeois ideology and not something natural to the world. The communists have no need to introduce the community of women, they say, because the community of women has already existed from time immemorial. So, moreover, bourgeois men are hypocritical and constantly seeking prostitutes in addition to their wives. It's like these bourgeois men are complaining against the communists, but they're out, spending money with prostitutes anyway. And this definitely, if we think about the way that marriage occurred during 19th century society, marriages are business types of relationships, much more than anything the idea that we might marry for romance or marry for love, that's secondary to women being attached to dowries and things like this. So abolition of marriage as treating women as property would then abolish, according to the communist perspective, would abolish the exploitation of prostitution as well. as well as the inequality of women in general. Marx and Engels then shift to addressing charges that that communism abolishes nationality. They say that the dissolution of nations will come naturally through the growth of the proletariat. This is just a descriptive fact according to their view of the unfolding of history. Same thing with religion. Religion comes up next. We hear some echoes of the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology here in the manifesto. Religion only, quote, survived the 18th century in a hollow form of appearance and an ideology subordinated to the bourgeois exploitation of the masses. Marx and Engels shift then to the dictatorship of the proletariat, although they don't use that term here. They predict that initially in the revolution, the proletariat will take over the state and seem despotic, and economic conditions will look bleak. This is all predicted in the manifesto. It's part of the process, the unfolding process of communism. And again, I think that we hear the echoes of Hegel and the notion. He has an idea of capital N notion, right? That we don't just see the one particular instance. What we're seeing is the whole process itself. And that's what he sees as reason. um, the conditions will differ by country, according to Marx and Engels. They list several growing pains that will happen, including excessive income tax, state centralization, centralization of transport, centralization of education, state-owned factories, more equitable distribution of labor between farms and factories, so the reallocation of wealth. This will give way to the condition of the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. So they recognize that there will be conflict, that there will be challenges in the unfolding of things, especially as the proletarian class takes over the modes of production that had been the explicit means of oppression for the bourgeois beforehand, the bourgeoisie rather. Next section, socialist and communist literature. And so they here part A anyway is reactionary socialism and feudal socialism. So here they're addressing ways that different voices have tried to say that something different is going to happen, or try to alleviate what they think is the inevitability of the proletarian class coming into power. So these are kinds of things that slow down that process of a move towards a communist society. Marx and Engels turn in this section then to address countermeasures attempted by the aristocracy to reinstate a kind of feudal socialism, or to essentially return to a paternalistic treatment of peasantry by well-intentioned social betters. So this is one of the things that happens, is like, yeah, you have this older aristocracy that they're not happy with the bourgeoisie conditions either. They're not happy with crass materialism. So they want to reinstate an older, almost feudal type of society. And current readers, so again, I'm trying in this section, as I move to the later half of the manifesto, I'm trying to like use some current examples of things. So if you watched the TV show Downton Abbey, which is about, the basically the fall of a massive estate in England, a landed estate, from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. It's like, so the show covers several different decades. But in the show, many of the servants who've been working at Downton Abbey want to uphold the dignity of the class divisions that have kept them employed. So they're not necessarily resentful of the fact that they are servants. The return to conservative values was meant to counter crass bourgeois mercantilism. Racists like Thomas Carlyle in England during the 1840s and 50s advocated for a return to slavery in the Caribbean, because they said that Carlyle says that Black people were inherently lazy and benefited from being forced to work. He's particularly talking about Jamaica, if you look at Carlyle stuff. And current day, very right wing not just politicians, but right-wing ideologues look back and they admire people like Thomas Carlyle for his racism, among other things, but it's tied to his conservatism. It's tied to his idea that some people are just naturally better at dominating other people, and that the other people who are dominated benefit from being dominated. That's part of this version of conservatism that obviously Marx and Engels are critiquing. Marx and Engels attach this move to localized socialism, which in its provincial form is unwilling to attend to the international struggle and thus implicitly works against it. So Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, who we'll read in a few weeks here, Lenin will rail against the German democratic socialists at the end of the 19th century in his book State and Revolution, for similar reasons. Feudal socialism is preserved by earlier forms of Christian religion that Nietzsche will also claim establishes Christianity as a kind of slave religion. It's a kind of religion that says, according to Nietzsche's reading anyway, that certain people deserve to be dominated. And Nietzsche, I would say Nietzsche is, of course, Nietzsche is no communist, but it's important to see the way that like Marx and Engels have their way of presenting things, but the ideas and the discussion is going on in a broader cultural milieu. In the next section they talk about petty bourgeois socialism. The petty bourgeoisie, according to Marx and Engels, are the remnants of a disappearing class of well-to-do burghers who benefited enough from the bourgeois conditions that they do not fit into the growing binary between bourgeoisie and proletariat. They present utopian aspirations even while they themselves are a dying class. It was particularly associated with France, this idea of petty bourgeoisie socialism. So socialists always want to have some sort of reform. They advocate for reform instead of revolution, right? And that's what makes them different from communists and Marxist perspective. Next section, C, German or true socialism. This movement attempted to reconcile German and French situations by regressing into humanist ideals that ultimately supported bourgeois ideology. It inadvertently placated a bourgeois regime and ignored the growing division between bourgeoisie and proletariat. From a contemporary Marxian perspective, this accounts for much of the resistance in the United States today. Towards more equitable conditions. There are still too many people, in other words, and this is indicative of the United States again, there are too many people who don't make much money, but who also benefit in a limited or entirely imaginary ways from the current regime of control. So they, in the long run, delay the inevitable shift, the formation of proletarian versus the bourgeois. They in the long run delay the inevitable through a kind of selfishness by which they think that they might actually be the ones who might benefit, or they might win the lottery. This is, I think, a common perspective among working class people in the United States, and not just conservatives, but I think a lot of people with conservative political values who really attach themselves to liberalism want to say like I at least want my own sort of choice to get better. I'm gonna make it. If I work hard enough, I'm going to be able to save up my own money and I'm gonna raise myself up into a different kind of class status. And that's what is left to me by a meritocratic bourgeois sort of focus on the individual who is just the individual rational being who owns his own property and is able to accumulate wealth as an individual. This section, I imagine, well, written in 1848, I don't know why I keep putting 19 in there, in 1848, directly informed Lenin's refusal to accept German democratic socialisms claims to political sway in the 1880s and 1890s. So we see that kind of a theme, the kind of push-pull of people unwilling to accept what Marx and Engels think is inevitable is the solidification of the two classes, the conflict between them, and then the revolution itself. The next section of the manifesto, we get conservative or bourgeois socialism. Some members of the bourgeoisie have a kind of conscience. They see that things are problematic. Here again, socialists tend to want to reform things. I'm going to jump here. This is what I mentioned at the beginning of the essay into a very contemporary situation again in the United States. So let's put this in current terms. These would be like the people who put up Black Lives Matter signs in the windows of their rich and almost entirely white neighborhoods. They renounce their white privilege and go to yoga studios to improve their spiritual condition by looking hot with two T's. They are elites who don't identify with the caste as elites, so they embrace and advocate a kind of wokeism. I put that term in quotes if you're listening to this in podcast. I don't use the term wokeism lightly, and I don't use it in the sense of Ron DeSantis and other right-wing ideologues, but I am invoking that term right now because it's important in terms of current cultural discourse in the United States right now. Right-wing politicians and media have it down to a science how many times they use the term woke in speeches or on the air to keep their audiences resentfully happy. So that's why I mention it, because the term woke is a term that has been used by people on the right and the far right in order to solidify their political party. And so they use it over and over and over again. And they usually attach it to some sort of or woke leftism or to an idea that anybody on the left is going to be an elitist, right? So that fuels the resentment of their constituents, and it makes them happy every time they rail against it. So this is about controlling cognitive space, media space. Something that we don't necessarily see in Marx is a really big difference in why the critical theorists of the 20th century shift towards an analysis of mass society, especially through the emergence of mass media, radio, television, things like that, which completely changes the game, I think, then with respect to how we think about this stuff as compared to Marx and Engels in the 1840s. So, however, current liberals, people who think of themselves as the left, but I think of them more centrist, I guess. Current liberals in the United States, those who identify with being on the left, in quotes, for them, many of whom are not actually on the left, if you push them to articulate their thinking, present their moral authority in terms of a status quo resistance to the ugliness of right-wing populists who have come to embrace any kind of affront to politics of respectability. So their moral authority of respectability always insulates them from their own bourgeois comfort zone. So meanwhile, both real racists and real misogynists, real haters of women, capitalize on people who just hate people who pretend that they are better than everyone else by being something like politically correct. So this is something that happens. This is part of the way the dialectic is functioning at this particular time. That people hate other people for asking them to talk or use gender terms or use racial terms in certain ways. And so they align that with being educated elites, people who think that they're better than other people. And then that creates more of an impulse to be shocking, to be disrespectful, and that insulates the identity of the person. And of course infuriates the so-called woke leftist, right? And so every time the people who see themselves on the left react to that kind of impulse of shocking misogyny, racism on the right, they actually are contributing that to the right the far right perhaps um, uh, um, uh, calcifying or solidifying of their identity by getting upset. And I see this over and over again in campus discourse and wider public political discourse in the United States. Um, uh, so most who are intentionally politically incorrect are, as the English say, taking the piss because a certain class of people position themselves as better than them. Saw this very much growing up with young white men who felt like resentful that they were being picked on or something. And so they developed these Nazi as like these flirtations with Nazism or with overt forms of racism, and they would act out. And we see this and some of course are serious about that sort of thing and they're assholes if you from my perspective but others are just get caught up in uh doing something because it makes them feel good to make fun of other people and then they don't have to sort of self-reflect on their white privilege or something like that um so it is for many people about the joy of fucking with somebody who thinks that they're better than you and the lack of belief that you will ever achieve the American dream that was promised to you. So you're resentful of the fact that you're not making it. Somebody else is trying to tell you how to live. And so you fuck with them, and that makes you feel better as a person. So that's part of the structure of resentment in current society. So that's why so many university-led efforts at inclusion simply raise the ire of resentment by right-wing thinkers, no matter their racial categorization. In the US in 2024, the populist tides have shifted. On the one hand, there's a real and enduring need to address systemic racism, masculinist sexism, etc. On the other hand, the right wing has largely succeeded in repositioning all attention to social inequality as a competition between different races, ethnicities, or gender identities, but rarely class differences. Rather, class differences come to enable those who resist elitist, quote, woke politics, solidifying a populace that is actively anti-intellectual, anti-democratic, and celebratory of bigotry in multiple areas. Returning to Marx and Engels, then, the result is this: the bourgeois as is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. Like I identify with my anti-racist politics because I learned it at school, and I'm standing up for the people who are beneath me, but I also benefit in some way from that. So there's a lot of contradictory impulses that are sort of going on here. Marx and Engels, from a strict sort of Marxian perspective here, what they would see in terms of all of the explosion of uh, controversy around identity politics is that it's a big uh, smokescreen that keeps people, um, maybe they're fighting about race, for example, maybe they're fighting about gender, maybe they're fighting about that you're a little bit more privileged than me, but you don't recognize it. And so the conflicts that erupt from that are a smokescreen that keep us from understanding that the class division between proletarian and bourgeoisie um, means that actually like we should be anti-racist in the proletarian movement because we're not being oppressed because of that. Rather, our conflicts about different identity are keeping the people who are really in power, the bourgeoisie, people in power over us, and then we can all get upset and fight amongst each other, right? That's the sort of Marxian class read reading of this, and they will say that we no longer have class analysis. We don't even talk in terms of class very much. We might use the term elite, but we use it so broadly that we confuse like anybody in higher education, for example, with being an elite. When like the difference between when I'm teaching this class at an urban, very, very diverse urban university that is mostly made up of people from working class backgrounds, confusing that with like me being like a tenured professor at Yale or something like that, which is a completely different um, part of the economy. Um, so I went into all of this because I am teaching this class in a university, and because the kind of language around all of this stuff and inclusivity, of course, in some senses is of course importance, but in of importance for sure. But the way that identity politics has been appropriated in terms of political divisions in order to keep people fighting against each other means that we sometimes mistake a localized argument, especially things in the United States, for example, right? Like, because we will battle over identity politics very rigorously in campus culture in the United States with little to no attention to struggles that are going on in Brazil, in throughout Europe, in India, in Africa, right? Like, so our localized, again, this comes goes to an earlier charge from the manifesto, right? What happens is we get these localized forms where we're trying to advocate for more liberation, but it's only liberation for um, certain people to be a little bit more accepted by the bourgeoisie instead of actually um, attaching itself to the real controls of material power or the modes of production itself. So that's one way, just an attempt really briefly to try to bring some of the manifesto into the present. You don't have to agree with me for any of that sort of stuff, but I open up that kind of realm for discussion and for thinking about how this might be relevant to today. So returning again to Marx and Engels, you in this the problem with this situation is that you have a bourgeois who is a bourgeois, but they're acting bourgeois for the so-called benefit of the working class. If those who desire social equality are simply woke leftists, then critique of inequity itself becomes a code for liberal elitism and something to be countered with the most flagrant forms of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, hatred of women, you name it, right? So the problem here that I'm saying is that if if whenever we talk about inequality, it automatically makes us into some sort of an elitist, woke leftist. That's the charge of the right and the far right. Every time we mention social inequity, then uh, we're in a real problem, right? Because like inequity, calling it out um, automatically makes you into an elitist, right? Which is a contradiction in terms. And it also emboldens the people who are racists, who are anti-Semites, who hate women, who don't want trans rights, whatever it happen, however it happens to appear. It emboldens that kind of thing and creates a kind of like a repetition or feedback loop, right? So that when we're talking about inclusion or inequity, we're doing it from we're buying into like the characterization that to do that is to be some sort of elitist to begin with. A real problem right now in society. Critical utopian socialism and communism. Next section. Marx and Engels finally critique a version of socialism aligned with what will later be called the social gospel. Such a disposition seeks to alleviate class struggle. Quote, they still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteres, uh, of establishing home colonies, of setting up little Icaria, duodecimo editions of the New Jerusalem, and all, and to realize all these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and the purses of the bourgeois. Um, I think that, I didn't write it in here, but like we might think about the economy of GoFundMe right now, right? Where we keep on moving away from uh, like any kind of belief that the state might help us out as people. And so we privatize gift economy, we privatize through nonprofits or NGOs, we privatize the process of making society into a better place. That's probably partly what I think that they're addressing here as well. And we might do it under the name of mutual aid, or we might do it because we identify as anarchists or something. But what we're really doing is we're participating in a marketized version of privatized economy that is really part of neoliberalism and not necessarily part of moving towards the next stage in society. Now, of course, I know I've jumped into the current situation. Like for Marx and Engels, neoliberalism is just not a term that they're dealing with. But I'm trying to kind of make us think about some of this stuff in the present a little bit. A couple of other just sort of basic terminology that I think comes from Marx and Engels, although they're not really analyzing it in the manifesto here. They've called, of course, at the end for working men of all countries to unite. Um, uh, and later on, when we get into Marx's thicker books that like Capital, the volumes of Capital, then we start getting a little bit more of his economic analysis. And what he says is that society works through two structures. There's a base structure, which is below, and this is the means of production, the tools or the machines or the factories, the land, the raw materials. That's what material analysis needs to always keep attention to. And with the base or the means of production are the relations of production. Who actually controls how things are produced? So the division, the terminology are the lumpen proletariat, the labor aristocracy, the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie. There also is the idea of private property, which of course is they've characterized in the manifesto as being the thing that's owned by the bourgeoisie. Capital, which is what allows us to invest in industry and to control the means of production, and then the commodities are the things that are produced by the production. The base structure, according to Marx, feeds into and maintains or helps to shape this superstructure. And in the superstructure, we have discussions about family, art, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, and education. And what shapes our feelings about any of those areas is ideology. So we want to look at and be able to analyze ideology so that we can see that the way that we might talk about art or the way that we might talk about family is really a process of reification, to go back to that term from the last lecture, right? Like of making an idea seem like it is a natural thing when really what it's doing is just maintaining a base structure that might be oppressive to certain classes of people. So the superstructure then is kind of feedback loop, right? Feeds back into the base structure by maintaining and shaping it. So the move is in a spiral process that we might also think of as in terms of Hegelian dialectic. One more thing, and so these images, you can just do Google image searches to pull up this. That's where I pulled it from the web. Yes, of course, yes, bourgeois. Speaking of bourgeois, people who are in control, Google, right? Uh, we also see again, and if you compare this to the image from my previous lecture where I had Hegel's theory of history up here, we see very, very much right behind Marx's theory of dialectical materialism or his theory of history. Here we see Hegel right behind it. It's just that what dialectical materialism says, instead of idealism's focus on ideas, is that we need to look at actual class conflict, right, as they've characterized in the manifesto here. So their version of history is that, yes, history progresses, just like Hegel had said, It is characterized by class conflicts. So in earlier society, you have like a primitive kind of communistic society, an unorganized society that becomes in conflict with division of labor, private property, and tribalism. Through that conflict, we get the emergence of something like empire. An empire tries to maintain itself by establishing a difference between it and the barbarians, just like in Aristotle, a barbarian is somebody who doesn't speak Greek. Through that conflict, we develop into a landed aristocracy. So you can think of the Roman Empire and the fall eventually of the Roman Empire ends up in the era of feudalism, where you have a landed aristocracy, you have a bourgeoisie, that arises and emerges through a mercantilism, through trade, especially trade connecting continents from around the world, where the bourgeoisie people make enough money that they become the newly rich people. And then they replace the landed aristocracy. We have Freemasons who are able to move more fluidly about to sell their particular expertise in building things. Stonemasons, for example, are part of this period. And eventually we get the period where the controls of production of commodities and the controls of the means of production land with the bourgeois democracy. But here we have factory owners who are part of the bourgeois, and the emerging class that Marx calls the proletarians. Again, it's not exactly just one class, right? We might still be, and this is what classic Marxists say, is that we're still in the process, and there might be all of these different versions of socialism or whatever, that or the smokescreen of identity politics or whatever you want to call it. From again, this is just like going from a Marxian sort of perspective, that they're delaying the inevitable, right? So when we got to a big sort of class or economic movement in the after the housing crisis in 2008, the implosion, we get the big mass movement of the 99 percenters versus the 1 percenters, right? Um, but then there's a lot of people who make enough money in between that, according to a Marxian perspective, that they're holding on to an economy that they think that they benefit from, or that they think that they're going to sort of make their way within, instead of aligning with the 99% of people who are in really increasingly dire conditions, right? So I have some other stuff on Gramsci and stuff that I'm not going to go into there for this lecture. So this is going to get us back to the end of this coverage of the Communist Manifesto. I said in the last lecture, Marx dies in 1883. There's only 11 people at his funeral. They his writings, and he's not really famous and influential so much during his time period. It's really through the efforts of his co-writer Engels, massively publishing his material, that we get his influence in the late 19th and then in the 20th century, as well. And it's up to debate. It's an open debate. So I'm just mentioning that it's debated whether or not the 20th century endeavors to create communist societies like the Soviet Union or Maoist cultural revolution, um, efforts of people like Che Guevara, like whether or not that is truly Marxian or not, is something that different people will debate. It does seem to be, I will say that Marxists or ideology critique goes in and out of fashion, and it tends to go in and out of fashion depending on how we're feeling about the economy. When our economies are in crisis, then people who are Marxists tend to sort of come a little bit more into the present. When our economy is doing well, especially in a liberal democratic economy or a capitalist economy, like in which I live, then when people feel like they're doing well, or doing okay, then the critique of the society becomes less dominant or less apparent. We will have to come back to especially all of that discussion about identity politics throughout the course, especially for those of you, if you're students of mine who are on campus and dealing with all sorts of issues that occur in a daily basis about the terminology that we use. So I know that, of course, that's not exactly in the reading of that that I'm extrapolating from the Communist Manifesto, but I definitely brought that into discussion here so that we can deal with it when we get to later things that we read in class, because this is a class on critical theory. So by the time that we get to somebody like Franz Fanon, who's dealing with race, or we get to Judith Butler, who's dealing with gender, or something like that, or when we're looking at uh, ideas of masculinist femininity and trans gender situations, the way that those discourses kind of are fed from the broader discourse that we call critical theory, right? Like the way that's in like critical race theory, yeah, it might have come and emerged out of critical theory, but we can't just talk about critical race theory from the beginning. We have to kind of see the broader trajectory of where all of this stuff is coming from historically, and that's kind of why I'm making those kind of leaps that might seem crazy to make at this point in our course. But if you look ahead to our reading schedule and some of the things that I have assigned, then it'll start making sense, hopefully, by the time that we're done with our time together. Thanks very much for watching this. If you're watching this in the public and you're getting something out of it, as always, I appreciate any kind of help from uh, Patreon as well, even if that seems like to participate in one of these things that Marx and Engels are railing against. Uh, I hope you have a great day, evening, morning, wherever, whenever you are. Thanks for watching or listening. Take care.